It started with a letter that felt more like a slap in the face than a polite notice. One chilly November morning, I trudged out to check the mail, still in my slippers and robe, and there it was, an envelope marked with the seal of the Cedar Hills Homeowners Association. The return address alone made my stomach churn. I already knew whatever was inside wasn't going to be good, but I couldn't have imagined it would go this far. I opened it while standing on the porch, steam from my coffee rising beside me. The letter was typed, official, and cold. It said, in no uncertain terms, that my Christmas light display, my pride and joy, was a disruption to neighborhood peace, a hazard to safety, and an excessive use of power in violation of local residential codes. In short, they banned me from putting up Christmas lights this year. No appeal, no exceptions. Just a flat-out ban. I stood there for a long minute, rereading the letter. The wind cut through my robe, but I barely noticed. What they didn't seem to understand was that decorating my house wasn't just something I did for fun. It was my thing. Every December, people from all over the county came to Cedar Hills just to see the Henderson Light Show. Kids pressed their noses against frosty car windows. Couples took selfies under my glowing archway. I'd even made the local news once. Twice, if you count the time the inflatable Santa collapsed on a UPS truck. This wasn't just about lights. It was about tradition, about joy, about the one time of year when everyone in the neighborhood seemed to smile at the same thing. And now, the HOA wanted to shut that down. They claimed it was for public safety, but I knew better. This was personal. Probably stirred up by someone jealous of the attention I got. Probably that sour-faced guy 2 doors down, Mr. Putnam, who never smiled and thought Christmas was a waste of electricity. At first, I considered writing an angry letter in response. I drafted 3, each one more heated than the last. But as I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by last year's tangled light strands and flickering snow globes, something occurred to me. This wasn't a setback. It was a challenge. If they thought they could dim my holiday spirit with one letter, they had another thing coming. I wasn't just going to decorate my house. No, that would be too simple, too expected. If my house couldn't be the brightest spot on the block, then maybe the whole neighborhood could. The idea hit me like a jolt of electricity. What if, instead of just lighting up my home, I helped light up every home, every tree, every front yard and rooftop? If they wanted to ban me from shining alone, then I'd make sure I wasn't alone. I'd make the entire neighborhood sparkle. I grabbed my phone and started texting, then calling. I reached out to everyone on my block, everyone I'd ever chatted with at the mailbox or waved to at the 4th of July picnic. I told them what the HOA had done. I asked if they wanted in on something big, something joyful, something a little rebellious. Surprisingly, the response was almost immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Turns out a lot of folks weren't too thrilled with the HOA's strict rules, and a lot more had always wanted to decorate but didn't know where to start. I offered to help. I told them I had the tools, the lights, the timers, the extension cords. All they needed was the spirit and maybe a ladder. Over the next week, my garage turned into Christmas Central. I unpacked bins of lights, tested miles of wiring, sorted ornaments, and drew up blueprints for synchronized displays. My nephew, who was home from college, came by to help rig power-safe outlets. My niece made a Spotify playlist of carols and classics. Even old Mrs. Canfield from across the street donated a box of vintage decorations she hadn't touched in years. Every day, more neighbors joined the project. Some brought lights of their own. Others brought snacks and hot chocolate. It turned into a kind of festival, a secret mission with a cause that felt bigger than just stringing up bulbs. We were standing up for joy, for togetherness, for the right to make December a little brighter. By the time the first weekend of December rolled around, the transformation had already begun. Houses that had never seen more than a single plastic wreath were now decked in glittering icicles and blinking stars. Lawns sprouted candy canes. Mailboxes wore Santa hats. Driveways shimmered under net lights like icy runways. My house stayed dark, just as the HOA ordered. But everything around it? It glowed. And we were just getting started. As word spread, more neighbors joined in. People I'd barely spoken to since moving in 5 years ago were suddenly stopping by with boxes of decorations, asking where they could help. There was Edna from Birch Lane, a retired teacher with a quiet smile who turned out to be a wizard with extension cords. Then there was the Kim family, new to the neighborhood and a bit shy, who brought over an inflatable snowman taller than their garage. Even Curtis, the high school sophomore who usually only came out to skateboard, offered to climb up on roofs and help staple light strings along the gutters. It was electric, literally and emotionally. For the first time in a long while, Cedar Hills felt like a community. I watched neighbors who'd never spoken before stringing lights together, laughing over cups of cider, and trading stories about past holidays. There was something healing about it, something unspoken but deeply needed. Maybe it wasn't just about defying the HOA. Maybe people were craving connection, tradition, and joy more than they realized. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Mr. Putnam, my ever-grumpy neighbor, stood across the street most evenings with his arms folded, his lips pursed tighter than a nutcracker's jaw. His house was the only one still pitch black, his lawn bare and dull as ever. I caught him muttering into his phone more than once, glaring at the glow creeping toward his property line. He even took pictures one night, probably to submit another complaint. But by then, it was too late. The neighborhood had caught fire with Christmas spirit, and there was no putting it out. I kept my promise to the HOA. I didn't decorate my house, not a single bulb. But what they failed to anticipate was that my house didn't have to shine for the neighborhood to glow. And oh, did it glow. By mid-December, every home on Pine Maple Circle was lit up like Times Square. Not just basic lights either. People got creative. One house did a 12 Days of Christmas theme with moving cutouts. Another synchronized their lights to music and broadcast the playlist over FM radio. It was dazzling. It was brilliant. It was loud. And it drove the HOA absolutely nuts. The first official warning came on December 14th. It was slipped under my door at 6 a.m., probably by someone trying to avoid confrontation. It said the unauthorized expansion of holiday displays was creating traffic congestion and potential light pollution. The best part? It cited me, by name, even though my house had 0 decorations. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. The next day, we organized a block-wide potluck in my driveway. Everyone brought something: cookies, cocoa, folding chairs. We watched holiday movies on a big projector screen and passed around marshmallows to roast over fire pits. Families came from neighboring streets to join. Kids rode wagons through the light displays. We even had a Santa Claus, Harold from down the road in a velvet suit borrowed from the community theater. The HOA sent a representative to investigate, but she left 15 minutes later with a plate of brownies and a smile. By the time December 20th rolled around, Cedar Hills had become a destination. Local news vans showed up. A drone company offered to film an aerial video. A radio station offered us a slot to talk about the light rebellion of Cedar Hills. And still, my house stood unlit at the center of it all, a silent beacon of resistance surrounded by a sea of glittering rooftops. What made it all the more perfect was that nobody could stop us. We weren't breaking any individual rules. There were no bylaws limiting the number of homes that could decorate. No maximum wattage spread across a neighborhood. The HOA had tried to make me the scapegoat, and instead, they'd made me the spark. I'll never forget the look on Mr. Putnam's face the night of December 23rd. He walked out to retrieve his mail and stood frozen in his yard, staring across the street. Someone had planted a row of illuminated candy canes along the sidewalk in front of his home, technically on public property, so it wasn't against any rule. He stood there, jaw clenched, as neighborhood kids danced by in Santa hats, and a woman on a bike waved to him with a grin. Then, in the ultimate twist of fate, the mayor showed up. No joke. The actual mayor of our town, Councilwoman Tammy Dawson herself, came by to take photos and post them on her social media. She called Cedar Hills a shining example of community spirit, and even suggested making our street part of the city's official holiday tour route next year. I stood next to her for a selfie, holding a cup of cider, trying not to smirk as Mr. Putnam slinked back into his dark, undecorated house. Christmas Eve arrived like a miracle. Snow fell gently that morning, coating the rooftops in powder and softening the glow of all the lights. The air smelled like cinnamon and chimney smoke. Neighbors gathered one more time, bundled up in scarves and boots, to sip hot drinks and admire their handiwork. My nephew played Christmas carols on a keyboard while his sister sang along. Laughter floated down the street, and every window shimmered with reflection. As the sky dimmed and the stars peeked out, I walked to the center of the block and looked around. It was stunning, like something out of a movie. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Each display told a story. Each home glowed not just with lights, but with warmth. And all of it started with one letter trying to shut it all down. I hadn't planned on saying anything, but as I turned to head back inside, someone shouted, "Speech! Come on, Dave!" A cheer went up, and someone handed me a cup of eggnog. I stepped up onto a lawn chair and cleared my throat. "Look," I said, holding up the letter I'd kept folded in my pocket. "I know this all started because someone told me I couldn't put up lights this year. And I'll be honest, I was mad. Real mad. But this? What we've done together? This is better than any light show I've ever run. Because it's not just mine. It's ours." They clapped. Some whistled. A few kids threw tinsel in the air. I smiled. They tried to ban my lights, so I lit up the whole neighborhood instead. The days after Christmas were like the golden hour of the season. The lights still twinkled every night, the snow stayed clean and fluffy, and the buzz around the neighborhood hadn't worn off. People who'd once rushed inside after work now took evening strolls to admire the displays. Cars slowed down at every corner. Strangers waved like old friends. Something had changed. Not just the street, but the people on it. I thought things might settle down after the holidays, that the HOA would quietly drop the issue and let it blow over. But I underestimated their pride and their persistence. On December 27th, another letter arrived. This time it was longer. 4 pages. Stapled. The HOA was investigating the coordinated display efforts, citing disruption of community standards and unsanctioned gatherings. They hinted at fines, possible legal action. They even brought up zoning codes. I read it out loud at the next community bonfire, and by the end of it, people were laughing so hard that one of the marshals nearly dropped her marshmallow in the flames. Still, I knew we had to be careful. If they wanted to play hardball, they might actually find some obscure clause buried deep in the HOA handbook to use against us. So I called a meeting at my place. It felt like something out of a movie. 20 neighbors squeezed into my living room, sipping cocoa and brainstorming how to protect our holiday rebellion. Edna suggested we form a committee. Marcus, a software engineer, said he'd dig into the HOA bylaws to look for loopholes. Young Rachel proposed we start a petition to formally change the lighting policies. People nodded. People volunteered. It wasn't just about lights anymore. It had become a movement. That night, for the first time since this all began, I realized we were building something permanent, something stronger than decorations or displays. We were reclaiming our sense of ownership, not just over our homes, but over our lives. We'd been letting the HOA dictate the tone of our neighborhood for years, quietly, passively. Not anymore. The next few days were a blur of emails, phone calls, and cookie deliveries to win over hesitant neighbors. We drafted proposals, set up a shared Google Drive, and even had a banner made that read, "Cedar Hills, a brighter place to live." It was corny, but it worked. By New Year's Eve, we had enough signatures to force a special vote on the HOA policies. And not just about lights. We proposed new guidelines for holiday decor, community events, and even the length of the infamous lawn height restrictions. It was bold, it was unexpected, and it sent the HOA board into a complete tailspin. That night, instead of heading downtown or staying in, the whole block gathered again, this time to ring in the new year as a united front. We strung up fireworks, legally approved of course, set out rows of lawn chairs, and counted down under a sky filled with stars and snow. Someone brought out a karaoke machine. Someone else spiked the cider. At midnight we cheered, we hugged, and a group of teenagers lit sparklers along the sidewalks in a zigzagging path of light. The mayor came back too, unofficially. She said she wanted to see what the fuss was about. She left with a plate of cookies and a promise to support our cause at the city council meeting. That alone made Mr. Putnam scowl for a solid 3 days. It wasn't until mid-January that the special vote was held. Turnout was huge. People who hadn't shown up for anything in years made their way to the community center bundled in coats and scarves. The old HOA board tried to stall, tried to complicate things. But we'd done our homework. Our proposals were clean, legal, and democratic. And we won, not just by a narrow margin, by a landslide. The HOA would no longer ban holiday decorations without majority neighborhood approval. Fines would be capped and subject to review. And a new committee, open to volunteers, would be formed to plan and coordinate future events, so no single person could be targeted again. I didn't run for the committee, though a lot of people asked me to. I figured I'd done my part. It was time for others to take the reins. Besides, I had something else in mind. That spring, I started sketching ideas for next Christmas. Not a solo show, not even a single street. I wanted to light up the entire neighborhood, block after block. I pitched it as a citywide celebration, a festival of lights. From band to bright, I called it, and wouldn't you know it, the city approved it. Now, as I sit in my garage, still labeled Christmas Central, sorting out cords and bulbs for next year, I think back to that first letter, the one that tried to shut me down, the one that backfired so spectacularly that it changed an entire community. They banned my Christmas lights, but in doing so, they lit a spark, and that spark became something beautiful. Spring in Cedar Hills felt different that year. There was still the usual rhythm of lawnmowers humming on Saturday mornings, kids riding scooters along the sidewalks, and the occasional bark of a dog chasing a squirrel. But now everything carried a sense of connection. People didn't just wave from driveways anymore. They stopped and talked, shared garden tips, offered help with fence repairs. Even Mr. Putnam, for all his grumbling, started nodding at folks when they passed by. The Light Rebellion, as the local newspaper had coined it, had shifted something deep in the heart of our neighborhood. We weren't just neighbors now, we were collaborators, co-conspirators in a quiet uprising of joy. I spent a lot of that spring working on blueprints for the festival I'd pitched to the city. From band to bright, a celebration of light and community. At first, it was just an idea scrawled on a napkin, but now it was becoming real. The city council had approved it unanimously. The mayor was backing it with a small grant, and I'd somehow become the unofficial project coordinator. Not exactly what I'd planned for my retirement, but I wasn't complaining. By May, we had committees formed: lighting, logistics, music, safety, and food vendors. People volunteered with enthusiasm I'd never seen before. Teenagers, retirees, single parents, even a few high school teachers pitched in. Harold, our community Santa, offered to manage the stage lineup. Edna organized a bake-off to accompany the tree lighting. Marcus, with his tech savvy, proposed an interactive map where visitors could vote on their favorite light display using QR codes. I found myself waking up excited every day, ready to dive back into planning. It felt like building something that would outlast me, something my grandkids could visit one day and say, "My grandpa helped start this." Still, I couldn't help but think about how it all began. That dumb letter. That cold December morning when I felt so alone and so frustrated. And now I couldn't walk down the street without someone offering me a coffee or asking about the next planning meeting. It was wild, humbling, and honestly a little hilarious. By midsummer, the festival had a date, the first weekend of December. It would be city-sponsored with street closures, food trucks, live music, and of course, lights. Lots of lights. We partnered with local electricians to help homeowners safely power large displays, and a lighting sponsor from the next town over donated thousands of feet of LED string lights. It was more than I'd ever dreamed. But with growth came pushback. The HOA board, what was left of it, had mostly been restructured after the vote. New faces, better energy. But Mr. Putnam, ever the stick in the mud, still had a seat as property standards advisor. And he used it. Oh boy, did he use it. He filed motion after motion, trying to limit festival hours, block off certain streets, and cap the number of attendees. But now, unlike before, he didn't have much support. His proposals got tabled, revised, or outright rejected. At one heated planning meeting, he stood up, red-faced and flustered, and asked, "What's next? Fireworks for Valentine's Day? A marching band for Arbor Day?" I smiled and said, Only if you're willing to lead it, Ron." The room burst out laughing. Even he cracked a reluctant smirk. Fall crept in with cool mornings and golden leaves, and anticipation built like static in the air. Halloween came and went, and still people kept asking about the festival. Kids were already counting down. Stores donated supplies. A local bakery offered to create a custom Band to Bright cookie box, with designs shaped like string lights and snowflakes. Our little idea was turning into something the whole city was proud of. The week before the festival, volunteers worked non-stop. We transformed the park into a wonderland, with tunnels of lights, oversized ornaments, glowing sculptures, and cozy photo spots. The fire department even agreed to light the main tree using the ladder truck. The atmosphere was electric, pun absolutely intended. And then finally, it was here. The first night of the festival, I stood at the edge of the crowd as people poured into the streets. Children screamed with delight, couples held hands under the glow of archways, and music filled the air. A brass band played carols. Carolers strolled between booths. Food trucks served steaming cups of cocoa and holiday tamales. When the time came to light the tree, the mayor handed me the switch. "Dave Henderson," she said, holding up the microphone, "what started as a band turned into a spark. And what you sparked turned into a movement. So tonight, we honor the power of community and the joy of not giving up." I flipped the switch. Thousands of lights erupted across the park, blinking and dancing in synchronized patterns. The crowd gasped, clapped, cheered. I stood still, overwhelmed. Somewhere behind me, someone shouted, "Long live the lights!" And a wave of laughter rolled through the crowd. Mr. Putnam stood near the cider booth, sipping slowly. He wore a scarf, red and green. A quiet nod passed between us. I nodded back. Later that night, as the crowd thinned and snow began to drift gently from the sky, I walked home alone down Maple Circle. Every house glowed. Every yard shimmered. And right in the middle of it all stood my house, decorated for the first time since that letter, bursting with lights. Not because I defied them, because we won. Because this time we all lit it up, together. In the days following the festival, the town buzzed with stories of the lights, the music, the laughter. Social media lit up with videos and pictures from every corner of Cedar Hills. One shot of the massive tree lighting even made the local TV news again, and a drone video of the synchronized displays was picked up by a regional station. It was surreal to see our neighborhood featured in headlines like, "The town that fought the ban with brilliance." That week, a woman from the next city over knocked on my door. She introduced herself as Melody from the Pine Creek Neighborhood Association and said, "We heard about what you did. Think you could help us do something similar?" And just like that, I became a consultant. It started small. Emails from other neighborhoods, questions about logistics, power sources, bylaws, coordination. Before long, I had a spreadsheet of folks from half a dozen cities asking how we organized it all. I was no expert, but I shared everything I could. Our mistakes, our wins, even copies of our proposals and vendor lists. What began as a rebellion turned into a template. By February, Cedar Hills had inspired 3 neighboring communities to start their own light festivals. Each had its own spin. One emphasized sustainability with solar-powered lights. Another incorporated winter cultural traditions from its residents. That's when it really hit me. This had grown bigger than us. It wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a tradition. A symbol, A story passed from one block to the next. Back home, things settled into a new rhythm. The neighborhood felt tighter, friendlier, even in the dead of winter. People organized coat drives and soup swaps. We created a shared email list for emergency alerts and block party announcements. Every week or so, someone dropped off muffins, pies, or invitations. It was like we'd cracked open a part of ourselves we hadn't realized was closed off. I'd often sit out front in the early morning with my coffee, watching the street slowly come alive, kids catching buses, folks walking dogs, and feel this quiet sense of pride. Not pride in decorations or awards or media attention, pride in us, in who we'd become. One afternoon in March, I noticed Mr. Putnam standing awkwardly at the edge of my driveway. He was holding a cardboard box and staring at it like it might explode. I stood and walked over, curious. "Everything all right, Ron?" I asked. He grunted. "Yeah, well, figured you might want these." He handed me the box. Inside were half a dozen strings of older Christmas lights, a few neatly folded extension cords, and a bag of heavy-duty clips. "They were my wife's," he said after a pause. "She used to go all out with the decorations. I packed them up after she passed and never touched them again." I blinked. That was the first time he'd ever mentioned his wife. "Thanks, Ron," I said, gently closing the box. "We'll put them to good use." He nodded once, stiffly, and turned to leave. But then he stopped. "Next year," he muttered, "maybe I'll finally put something up again. Just maybe something small." I didn't say anything. I just smiled. It was enough. As spring gave way to summer, we started planning year 2 of the festival. This time, we had funding, sponsors, and an official city committee. I stayed on as an advisor, but I stepped back from leading it. The next generation of organizers, Rachel, Marcus, and a few new neighbors, had the reins now. They were full of ideas, and frankly, better organized than I'd ever been. Watching them take charge made me realize something else. The legacy wasn't just in the lights, it was in the leadership we'd sparked. These weren't just volunteers, they were future community leaders. The light show had become the beginning of something far brighter than any decoration. One particularly hot July afternoon, I stood in my garage organizing supplies when I found that original HOA letter, the one that had banned my lights. It was still crumpled, the crease worn down from months in my coat pocket. I laughed, reading it again. Funny how one small act of control can create such an explosion of freedom. I thought about framing it, not as a spiteful trophy, but as a reminder, a memento of how the smallest spark can light up the darkest places. A week later, I donated the box of Ron's lights to the community supply bin we kept in Edna's garage. A few strands were old and missing bulbs, but most still worked. I tested them myself one evening. They blinked slowly, red, green, blue, like little memories still shining, quietly persistent. That fall, Cedar Hills was officially named the city's Community of the Year. We were honored at a banquet. A fancy certificate was presented. But none of that matched the moment I saw a little girl, no older than 6, dragging her dad around the park and yelling, "Daddy, look! There's the gingerbread house from the Lights Festival." Her eyes sparkled like she believed in magic. Autumn arrived with that crisp snap in the air that made everything feel possible. Leaves painted the sidewalks in gold and amber, and even though the festival was still 2 months away, decorations were already starting to creep into conversations and garages. The second annual From Band to Bright festival was shaping up to be bigger than any of us had imagined. Word had spread well beyond the city limits. Local businesses were offering sponsorships, regional artists reached out to perform, and a home improvement store donated an entire truckload of LED lights to the neighborhood. It was like the entire city had collectively decided, if we're doing this, we're doing it big. What amazed me the most was that it wasn't just about Christmas anymore. Sure, the lights still took center stage, but the festival had evolved. There were booths for local artisans, food tastings from cultures all across town, and even a corner where kids could write holiday cards to seniors at the local care center. Cedar Hills, which once only spoke in HOA memos and silent stares, was now a hub of color, flavor, and generosity. It felt like every house had become its own story. The Marshalls across the street set up a life-sized snow globe made from an old greenhouse dome and artificial snow machines. Edna crafted dozens of tiny gnome figurines and created a gnome village along her walkway. Even Ron, Mr. Putnam, put up a glowing nativity scene in his front yard, which was so subtle and tasteful that it almost stunned the rest of us. "I found it in storage," he told me casually one day while walking his dog. "Figured it was time to let some light in again." Something about that stuck with me. Let some light in. That's exactly what we'd all done, in our own ways. As opening night approached, excitement buzzed through the air like electricity. The planning committee had it all mapped out. Timed lighting displays coordinated by street, hot cider and cocoa stations on every block, even a Lights and Lyrics concert on the town green featuring a cappella groups from the local college. But even with all the logistics and planning, I found myself thinking more about the quieter things, like how the Wilkersons, who moved in during the summer, told me they'd never lived in a place where people actually talked to their neighbors. Or how one evening I caught sight of two teenagers, one of them from a family that had once opposed the festival, hanging lights on a house together, laughing like they'd been best friends for years. It wasn't just the bulbs or wires, it was the connections. We'd built a neighborhood with a heartbeat. That night I took a walk. No reason. Just one of those fall evenings where you feel pulled outside by the air itself. The sky was clear and dotted with stars. Some houses had already started testing their lights, little previews of the brilliance to come. The soft hum of music floated from a garage a few blocks down. Somewhere, someone was baking. Cinnamon, maybe, or nutmeg. I paused near the center of the neighborhood and looked around. Almost every home glowed, whether from string lights, porch lanterns, or just warm, welcoming windows. And for the first time since all this started, I didn't feel like the instigator, or the organizer, or the guy who defied the ban. I just felt like part of something good, something real, a movement that had grown so far beyond me. And I liked that. The festival's second year opened with a bang, literally. A timed fireworks show launched from the community park just as the mayor flipped the main switch. Light flooded the streets. Cheers echoed. Children screamed with joy, and parents took pictures like they were capturing a once-in-a-lifetime moment. But it wasn't once in a lifetime. Not anymore. It was ours now. A tradition. Midway through the evening, Rachel, now co-chair of the planning committee, found me sipping cider near the fire pit behind the library. "You good?" she asked, nudging me gently. I smiled. "Better than good. You all pulled off something incredible." She shrugged like it was no big deal, but I saw the pride in her eyes. "We had a good teacher." I looked out at the crowd. Nah, you had each other. She grinned and ran off to check on the choir stage. The rest of the night passed in a warm blur. Singing, laughter, dancing, lights blinked in time with music, families posed under glowing archways, neighbors swapped stories over steaming mugs and homemade cookies. The festival wasn't just a celebration anymore, it was a declaration that we belonged to each other. That joy mattered, that even rules meant to control could be rewritten by kindness, unity, and a few thousand light bulbs. As the crowd began to thin and the music faded, I stood alone for a moment at the end of Maple Circle, my street, the one where it all started, where they tried to ban a little joy, where we decided to share it instead. Winter came fast that year. By Thanksgiving, Cedar Hills was already draped in string lights and inflatable snowmen. For the first time in our town's history, people were decorating before the turkey was even carved. No one was waiting for permission. The spark we'd lit had become a torch, passed hand to hand, house to house. I found myself doing things I never used to, like hosting hot chocolate nights in my garage or helping a neighbor's teenage son untangle a 200-foot net of lights. My tools were always borrowed, my ladder never in one place for more than a day, and I loved it. That simple, everyday chaos that comes with being part of a community that actually shows up for one another. By mid-December, I had to admit, this wasn't just a tradition anymore. It was an identity. It was who we were. I remember one evening when a couple from 3 towns over stopped their car in front of my house. I was adjusting a reindeer that kept tipping sideways and they rolled down their window. "Excuse me," the woman called out. "Are you the man who started this whole thing?" I stood, brushing snow off my gloves. Well, technically, I just refused to take my lights down. The rest of this? That was all them. She smiled. We just wanted to say thank you. This neighborhood gave us hope. Our community, it's not like this. Not yet. But maybe next year. They drove off before I could say much more. But I stood there a long while after, letting their words settle. Hope. That was it. That's what we'd really strung up along the rooftops and trees. That was the current running through every bulb and battery pack. And the thought that it could spread, that other places could catch that same flame, well, it made the cold sting a little less. Later that week, the city sent an official photographer to document the displays. We were going to be featured in a holiday tourism brochure. A tourism brochure for a neighborhood that once couldn't agree on where to put a recycling bin. I watched as families posed together, as kids made snow angels in yards wrapped in LEDs, as dogs wore light-up collars and people clinked mugs over their fences. I even caught a glimpse of Ron Putnam handing out candy canes dressed in a red scarf and a surprisingly festive fedora. He still grumbled, of course, but now he grumbled while offering warm drinks to strangers. And that might have been the biggest win of all. One night, not long before Christmas, the power flickered. It was bound to happen eventually. So many lights, so much cheer, and one too old transformer. The neighborhood plunged into darkness for a whole 10 minutes before the backup systems kicked in. A few people panicked. A few others laughed, but something interesting happened. Phones came out, not to complain or record the blackout, but to shine a little light. People turned on flashlights, pulled out candles. Neighbors walked across the street with lanterns and battery packs. Within moments, people were helping each other reconnect temporary lights, sharing power strips, checking on the elderly. It wasn't frantic, it was kind, it was calm, it was us. And when the lights blinked back on, the crowd didn't cheer. They sang. Somehow, no one quite remembers who started it. We all just broke into song. A gentle off-key chorus of Silent Night echoing down the snow-covered streets. No microphones, no stage, just people, lit from within. That was the moment I knew. The lights weren't the story. We were. After Christmas, I sat down to write a letter. Not to the HOA, not to the city council, not even to the newspaper. It was a letter to myself, folded and tucked in an old photo album I kept in my den. It read, "You thought they took something from you when they banned your lights, but what they really did was give you a reason to reach out, to shine louder, to bring people together. Don't ever forget how it felt, the first night it all lit up, not because of spite, but because of connection. You didn't fight them. You found us." That letter still sits there, tucked between pictures of my grandkids and a snapshot of the very first tree lighting. The world didn't change overnight. There were still rules, still meetings, still the occasional person who muttered under their breath that things were getting out of hand. But now the rules worked with us. The meetings ended in laughter, and even the muttering came with a side of hot cocoa and maybe a cookie or two. I had no idea what would come next, but I knew one thing for sure. If they ever tried to ban the lights again, we'd light up the whole world. January rolled in like a quiet exhale after the noise and wonder of December. The lights, slowly unplugged and packed away, left behind ghost outlines on rooftops and fences. But even in their absence, something warm lingered in the neighborhood. You could feel it in how people waved a little longer at each other, how kids kept playing in driveways even after school started back, how neighbors stopped to talk about plans for spring gardening or a community barbecue. It turned out that the lights had simply been the starting point. The committee that had organized the festival decided to stay active year-round. They renamed themselves the Cedar Hills Unity Council and started tackling other things: community cleanup days, shared tool libraries, even a mentorship program between retirees and local students. I joined a few of the meetings, mostly to offer support, but I made it a point to let them lead. They didn't need me in charge anymore, and that was exactly how it should be. One snowy afternoon, I passed by Edna's house and noticed a handmade sign planted in her yard. It read, "Next, Spring Lantern Walk, coming in April." She was already dreaming up the next event, one that didn't rely on electricity, just paper, candles, and imagination. "We don't need December to make this place glow," she told me, eyes sparkling. "We've got enough spirit to last all year." She was right. That same week, I got a letter in the mail, handwritten, stamped with a gold seal. Inside was a formal invitation from the State Office of Civic Engagement congratulating Cedar Hills for being nominated for a statewide Community Excellence Award. I chuckled as I read the letter, remembering how all this had started, with one crumpled violation notice and a string of red and green bulbs. Funny how far things had come. I took the letter down to the park, where Marcus and Rachel were helping shovel snow off the basketball court so local kids could play. I read it aloud. They both froze. "We're being recognized?" Marcus asked, wide-eyed. I nodded. "Looks that way." Rachel grinned. "For breaking the rules?" "For rewriting them," I corrected. "Together." As spring crept in, the snow began to melt, but the energy never faded. The Lantern Walk was a resounding success. Kids and adults crafted hundreds of paper lanterns, painting them with wishes, memories, and dreams. On the evening of the event, the entire neighborhood walked together. Lanterns held high, soft glows bouncing off the sidewalk. One lantern read, "Hope never left." Another simply said, "Thanks for the lights." And another, "This is home." A few months later, I was invited to speak at a leadership summit in a nearby city. The organizers asked if I could share how Cedar Hills turned a neighborhood dispute into a model for community building. I was nervous. I'd never considered myself a speaker, let alone someone with a message. But I agreed, mostly because I figured if I could help just one more person start something bright, then it was worth the nerves. I told them everything about the letter, the ban, the first quiet act of defiance, the neighbors who stood up, the lights that became a bridge, the songs, the cider, the silence in the snow. I didn't sugarcoat it either. I talked about the work it took, the fear, the early tension, the difficult conversations with people who thought differently. But I ended with this: you don't fix a community by pointing fingers. You fix it by offering a hand, hanging a light, and saying, "Let's build something together." The room clapped, and I blushed like a school kid. Afterward, people came up to me, city planners, teachers, students, even a couple of police officers. They asked for advice. They shared their own challenges. They told me that our story gave them a place to start. I walked out into the sun that afternoon, feeling lighter than I had in a long, long time. Not because of what I'd said, but because I realized something. We hadn't just lit up a neighborhood. We'd lit a path. Back in Cedar Hills, things kept rolling forward. A new family moved in next door to me in early summer. The parents looked exhausted, moving truck still half full, boxes everywhere. I offered them coffee and a set of extension cords just in case. The dad laughed. "Extension cords?" I grinned. "You'll see." By the end of the week, they were already signed up to help with the community mural project on the side of the old library. Because that's how things went now. Someone always stepped up. Someone always reached out. And every now and then, someone still knocked on my door and asked, "Hey, weren't you the guy who lit up the whole neighborhood?" And I always gave the same answer with a smile. "Nope, we did." Summer brought a different kind of light to Cedar Hills. The warm, golden kind that filtered through tree leaves and danced across backyard fences. The whole neighborhood seemed to carry itself with a newfound ease. Gone were the days of side-eye glances and HOA turf wars. Now, the biggest complaints were whose turn it was to bring lemonade to the community movie nights, or why there weren't more lawn chairs at the potluck. It was the kind of normal that felt extraordinary. One evening in July, I was sitting on my porch when a little girl I didn't recognize wandered up with a handful of colored chalk. She looked about 6 years old and wore a floppy sun hat 2 sizes too big. She didn't say anything, just started drawing flowers and stars at the edge of my walkway. After a while, I leaned forward and asked, "What's all this?" Without looking up, she replied, "My mom says this house is where the light started. I wanted to make it pretty again." I chuckled. "Well, you're doing a great job." When she finally skipped off, her drawings trailing behind her, I just sat there, staring at that messy, beautiful chalk mural, thinking about how this whole story had passed from headline to history in the minds of our youngest neighbors. It wasn't rebellion to them. It was tradition. It was normal. It was home. Later that week, the city hosted a regional Neighborhood Spirit Day, inviting communities to set up booths showcasing what made their streets special. We set up a modest table, just a few photos and a looping video from last year's festival. No big signs, no sales pitch, but people flocked to us. They asked questions. They listened to stories. Some even took down notes. The funny thing was, we weren't trying to impress anyone. We were just being honest. That authenticity, messy, imperfect, sincere, seemed to be what people wanted most. At one point, an older gentleman with a camera asked me if he could take my picture next to the display. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. As he snapped the photo, he said, "You know, this'll be in a magazine. Might make you famous." I laughed. "Let's hope it makes the idea famous, not me." He nodded. Fair point. By the end of summer, Cedar Hills had launched 3 new community efforts. A monthly skills swap, where people offered to teach everything from cooking to coding. A neighborhood quiet hour for people who needed peace and space, and a walking club that turned into more of a walking therapy session. The transformation was deep, and it wasn't about decorations anymore. Not really. It was about what happens when people stop waiting for someone else to make things better, when they decide to do it themselves, together. In early September, the mayor visited the neighborhood again. This time, no press, no ceremony. Just a stroll with her dog and a few city planners in tow. I ran into her near the community garden, which was now 3 times its original size. "Still glowing, I see," she said. "Always," I replied. "Just with tomatoes instead of twinkle lights these days." She grinned. "The city council's been reviewing our policies around HOA oversight. Might be time for some updates. Your neighborhood gave us a lot to think about." I offered her a fresh cucumber. "Glad we could help." That night, as I sat at the dining room table, I pulled out the old violation letter, the one that started it all. The ink was faded now, the corners soft and curled. It felt like an artifact from another life. I almost threw it away. But then I realized it wasn't just paper. It was proof. Proof that something small, something meant to shut down a little joy, had sparked a fire instead. A fire that warmed a neighborhood, a city, and, maybe someday, beyond. So I slid it into a frame, added a small handwritten note that said, "From this we grew," and hung it in the hallway near the front door. Everyone who visits asks about it, and I always tell them the same thing. That's the moment everything changed. As autumn painted Cedar Hills with its fiery reds and burnt oranges, I found myself reflecting more and more on the journey we'd taken. What started as a simple string of Christmas lights had blossomed into a movement that rewrote the story of our neighborhood. I used to think it was about defiance, about standing up to the rules that tried to dim our spirits. But now I understood it was about something far bigger. Connection. The nights grew longer, and with them, the urge to light up the dark returned. This year, the festival committee introduced a new tradition, a Light the Future night, where families would not only decorate, but also share stories about what community meant to them. I was asked to open the event with a speech, and though I'm not much for public speaking, I agreed. Standing in front of the crowd, with the glow of thousands of lights reflected in every eye, I felt a mix of nerves and pride. "I want to thank every single person here," I began, voice steady but warm. "When this all started, it was just me and a string of lights. But you, each of you, took that light and made it shine brighter than I ever imagined. You turned a fight into friendship, a ban into a beacon, And that's what community really is. People coming together to lift each other up, even when the rules say otherwise. There were a few tears, a lot of applause, and that night, as the main switch clicked on and the neighborhood erupted in a sea of color, I knew we had crossed into something lasting. But life isn't just light and celebration. Not long after the festival, the neighborhood faced a new challenge. A large development company proposed building a shopping center on the edge of Cedar Hills. Many feared it would disrupt the character and tight-knit feel we'd fought so hard to create. Community meetings filled with tension and uncertainty replaced the cheerful gatherings we'd grown used to. I could feel the old frustration bubbling up again. But this time, things were different. Instead of dividing us, the challenge brought us closer. We formed action groups, invited city officials to listen, and crafted a vision for responsible growth that prioritized green spaces and local businesses. I helped draft a petition, but more importantly, I showed up at every meeting, reminding everyone what we'd built together and what was worth protecting. One chilly evening, as the group debated a particularly heated topic, I looked around the room and thought about that first night of Christmas lights. The moment when one person's small act sparked a neighborhood's transformation. "Remember," I said quietly, "we're not just fighting for property or rules. We're fighting for our community, our home. And that means listening, compromising, and standing united." The room fell silent, then nodded in agreement. Months later, the development plan was revised to incorporate many of our suggestions. The shopping center became a community hub with parks, walking trails, and local artisan shops, a place that welcomed growth without sacrificing heart. Through it all, the lights remained a symbol of who we were. Even during the toughest times, the string of bulbs that once got me in trouble still hung proudly across my porch. They reminded me, and everyone else, that a little light can go a long way, especially when it's shared. As the second winter after the ban approached, the festival committee decided to expand the celebration beyond Cedar Hills. Neighboring towns were invited to join in, creating a regional light trail that stretched for miles. The idea was simple: to spread joy and community spirit far beyond what any of us could have imagined. When the night of the expanded festival arrived, I stood at the edge of our neighborhood, watching as families from all over gathered under the twinkling arches we'd built. The air was filled with laughter, music, and the soft hum of countless bulbs glowing in unison. A little girl tugged on my coat and asked, "Are you the guy who started all this?" I smiled down at her. "Nope, we all did." She grinned, her eyes wide with wonder. And in that moment, I realized the story wasn't about me or any single person. It was about the light we create together. One bulb, one person, one neighborhood at a time. Winter had come full circle. The streets of Cedar Hills, once quiet and dim under a gray sky, now pulsed with a warm glow that seemed to come not just from bulbs and lanterns, but from the hearts of everyone who lived here. The fight that started with a simple ban on Christmas lights had blossomed into something far greater, a testament to community, resilience, and the power of light to bring people together. That final December, as I stood outside my house watching families stroll by with mugs of cider and children chasing snowflakes, I felt a deep sense of peace. The lights were brighter than ever, strung from every rooftop, wrapped around every tree, and shining through every window. They weren't just decorations anymore. They were symbols of hope, of unity, of a neighborhood that refused to be divided. I thought back to the very first night when I refused to take down my lights and the neighborhood slowly followed. How far we had come, how many hands had reached out, how many voices had joined in song, and how many lives had changed simply because one person decided to shine a little brighter. A young woman approached me, her toddler bundled in a snowsuit clinging to her leg. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything you did, for starting this. It gave us a home where we didn't have one before." I smiled, my eyes misting. Number we all did. It was never just me. As the clock neared midnight, the community gathered in the park for the final countdown. The mayor was there, the children, the elders, the newcomers, all united under a blanket of stars and twinkling lights. When the clock struck 12, the crowd erupted in cheers and the sky filled with fireworks, bursts of color reflecting off snow-covered rooftops. I held my breath and watched as the lights seemed to pulse in rhythm with the explosions. Bright, alive, unstoppable. In that moment, I knew something important. No band could ever truly silence a community's light. No rule could ever dim the spark of hope and togetherness. Because when people come together with love and purpose, they create a light that lasts far beyond any season, one that can't be turned off, unplugged, or banned. And that light? It's the brightest thing in the world. I turned back toward my home, the glow of the neighborhood wrapping around me like a warm embrace. Tomorrow and every day after, we'd keep lighting the way, not just with bulbs and lanterns, but with kindness, courage, and the unbreakable bond of community. After all, that's what Christmas and life is really about.